Welcome to the debate. So, for centuries, the red thread of fate has really been held up as this ultimate romantic ideal.
Oh, absolutely. It's a gorgeous concept.
Right. It's from East Asian mythology, and the basic idea is that an invisible red cord is tied around the fingers of two people who are destined to meet.
And be together.
Yeah, exactly. And the defining rule of this bond is that the thread might stretch over vast distances, or, it might tangle through complicated circumstances, but it will never, ever break.
It is essentially pitched as the ultimate security blanket for the human heart.
It really is. But, modern psychology has a very different name for this unbreakable destiny, which is a trauma bond.
Wow. Yeah, that's a sharp turn.
It is. Today we're looking at how clinical relationship psychologists view this exact myth, not as a romantic ideal, but as a deeply dangerous psychological trap.
And it's a fascinating collision, of ancient philosophy and modern clinical practice, because the imagery of the red thread was designed to be beautiful.
Right. It implies a built-in elasticity to our human connections.
Exactly. No matter how chaotic the world gets, the bond is secure. But you are absolutely right that modern analysis takes a much darker view.
It really does.
Analysts point out that the romanticization of soulmates is frequently used to justify staying in, profoundly toxic, dead-end relationships. We're seeing people endure absolute emotional suffocation.
All while convincing themselves that the pain is merely the thread tangling.
Yes, exactly.
Which sets up our central disagreement for today. Does the very concept of an unbreakable destiny inherently strip us of our autonomy and set a psychological trap?
Or is the danger purely located in how our contemporary society misinterprets and frankly weaponizes this ancient romantic ideal?
I take the position that the concept of an unbreakable destiny is inherently dangerous. By demanding a belief in a bond that fundamentally cannot break, the myth functions exactly as the clinical analysis describes, a red noose.
Right.
It structurally strips individuals of their agency, and it creates the perfect psychological architecture for enduring emotional suffocation.
Well, I come at it from a different way. I maintain that the myth itself remains a beautiful, functional, romantic ideal.
Even with the clinical data?
Yes, because it traditionally represented healthy relationship resilience. The danger arises strictly from contemporary society's corruption of the myth.
How so?
We live in a culture that misapplies the concept of destiny to rationalize the sunk cost fallacy. Modern individuals twist the concept to justify staying in situations they know are toxic. The myth isn't trapping them.
Their own modern psychological anxieties are?
Exactly.
Look, to understand how this trap actually functions, we have to look closely at the specific mechanics of the myth. Specifically, that phrasing, the thread may stretch or tangle.
Right.
I would argue that providing a built-in excuse for tangling is precisely what fosters trauma bonding in modern relationships.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following you here. Are you saying the myth actually causes the abuse or just gives the victim a language to excuse it?
Because those are two very different things, yeah?
Right.
I'm saying it provides the psychological framework that allows the abuse to take root and flourish. Let's break down how trauma bonding actually works on a neurological level.
Sure.
Because it isn't just about making bad choices. It is about a dopamine cycle. In a toxic dynamic, you have intense highs and terrifying lows.
The intermittent reinforcement cycle.
Exactly. When the partner is abusive or withdraws affection, the victim's cortisol levels spike. They're in distress.
Right, their body is literally sounding an alarm.
Yes. And then the partner comes back, apologizes, and offers affection. That reconciliation triggers a massive rush of dopamine. So over time, the brain literally becomes addicted to that cycle of distress and relief.
Okay, so where does the myth come in?
Well, inject the red thread of fate into that cycle. The brain is experiencing intense cognitive dissonance. The gut is screaming, I am in danger, this person is hurting me.
But the belief system is saying, we are tied together by destiny.
Exactly. How does the victim resolve that dissonance? They use the myth. They tell themselves, this abuse, this cycle of fighting and making up, this isn't a red flag to leave.
This is just the thread tangling.
Yes. By providing a romanticized vocabulary for dysfunction, the myth actively encourages people to endure that dopamine addiction. Enduring the pain becomes a twisted form of romantic heroism.
Because walking away goes against fate itself.
Right, so suffering is just proof of your commitment to the destiny.
Look, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay.
You are projecting a highly modernized pathological definition of tangling backward onto an ancient concept. Traditionally, the tangling of the thread was meant to symbolize normal external relationship hurdles.
Like what?
We're talking about famine, war, geographic separation, illness, or just the everyday friction of two human lives trying to merge. It was a metaphor for the grit and resilience required to maintain a lifelong partnership.
Okay, sure.
It was never designed to be a blanket excuse for interpersonal toxicity.
But regardless of what it was designed for centuries ago, clinical psychologists are pointing out a massive flaw in how the idea operates today.
Right.
The reality is that people are enduring emotional suffocation precisely because they convince themselves it is just a tangle.
Right. They convince themselves. The modern individual is doing the twisting here. And, we have to look at the environment they're operating in to understand why.
You mean modern dating?
Yes. Think about the landscape of contemporary dating. It is entirely defined by the paradox of choice. You open an app and you have thousands of potential partners at your fingertips.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
Superficial swiping, ghosting, an endless carousel of first dates. It creates a profound, exhausting sense of isolation and cognitive overload. People are absolutely desperate for certainty. They want to get off the ride.
So they latch on to the first person who gives them a dopamine hit?
They latch onto the person who gives them a spark. And to protect that spark from the terror of the endless swipe, they immediately slap the label of destiny onto it.
Ah, I see.
They take this ancient concept of the red thread and they weaponize it against their own better judgment. When the relationship reveals itself to be a dead end a year later, they don't want to admit they made a poor choice.
And they definitely don't want to go back to the dating apps.
Exactly. So they use the myth to rationalize the sunk cost fallacy. The myth isn't telling them to stay in an abusive dynamic. Their own modern terror of being alone is what's keeping them there.
I mean, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it assumes the individual is making a fully rational, conscious choice to misapply the myth just to avoid dating apps.
Well, maybe not fully conscious, but
You're framing this as though people are just using fate as a convenient alibi for their own insecurities. But when you introduce the concept of an unbreakable destiny into a relationship, you aren't just giving someone an excuse.
what are you giving them then?
You're giving them a cosmological mandate. Let me give you a Blinkist level takeaway here. Destiny is the ultimate enemy of boundaries.
How do you mean?
Well, a boundary only exists if there is a consequence. To enforce a boundary, you have to be willing to walk away. But the myth explicitly asserts the thread will never break.
Right.
If you deeply internalize that, you stop viewing the relationship as a voluntary partnership, you start viewing it as a law of physics that you are subjected to.
Interesting.
If the bond cannot break, you literally cannot walk away. Your boundary is a bluff, and abusive partners sense that immediately.
But this ignores the specific language used by the psychologists analyzing this phenomenon. They call this trap the red noose of our own making.
True.
I want to heavily emphasize that second half of our own making. That phrase directly supports my position. The clinical consensus isn't that people are helpless victims of a mythological concept.
But they are trapped.
Yes, but they are actively tying the noose themselves. They are voluntarily surrendering their agency.
I think voluntary is a very dangerous word to use when we're discussing emotional suffocation and trauma bonds.
But it is the necessary word if we are going to be honest about human behavior. Let's look at the psychology of why someone would construct a red noose for themselves.
Okay.
Taking responsibility for your own life, recognizing that you've spent 5 years with a partner who is draining your soul, and making the active choice to blow up your life.
Divide your assets, start over.
Exactly. That requires immense psychological heavy lifting. It is pure agony. It is fundamentally easier to surrender your agency to fate.
Sure.
If you believe the universe tied you to this person, then you are absolved of the terrifying responsibility of having to untie yourself. People allow themselves to be slowly suffocated because the alternative is simply too difficult to face.
Admitting there's no destiny.
Right. Admitting the relationship is just a failure and that they must take action. The myth is just the scaffolding they use to build their own denial.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. You're saying they use the myth to avoid making a choice.
Yes.
I am arguing the myth destroys their capacity to perceive choice in the first place. It's like handing someone the steering wheel to a car, but convincing them the car is actually on train tracks.
Okay, I'm following.
Even if they see a cliff approaching, they won't turn the wheel because their reality has been defined by the belief that the path is already set by the rails. They don't think, I'm choosing not to steer.
They think steering is impossible.
Exactly. This is exactly how the belief in an unbreakable destiny functions.
So you are saying the myth is the train tracks.
I am saying the myth is the belief in the train tracks. By telling someone that they are bound by a thread that cannot break, you structurally remove the option of leaving from their cognitive architecture.
Right.
You can't accuse someone of voluntarily driving off a cliff if you have convinced them that the steering wheel is disconnected. The psychological consequence of believing in an unbreakable destiny is the total loss of individual autonomy.
I hear you.
The emotional suffocation isn't a choice they are making to avoid responsibility. It is the inevitable result of a belief system that denies them their agency from the very start. The trap isn't a modern misapplication, it's built into the blueprint of the myth.
That's a really compelling argument, but have you considered how the clinical analysis actually resolves this problem?
In what way?
Because the analysis breaks down precisely where the psychologists introduce the solution. They don't say the car is actually on train tracks.
Right.
They state that true liberation in modern love requires the terrifying courage to take a pair of scissors and cut the divine thread yourself. If they have the ability to pick up the scissors and cut the thread, then they always possessed agency.
But they didn't know it.
Exactly. The steering wheel was always connected. They just had to choose to turn it.
Look, if the steering wheel was always connected, why do psychologists describe the act of cutting the thread as requiring terrifying courage?
Well,
If this were merely a matter of opening one's eyes and dropping a bad excuse, it wouldn't be terrifying. It's terrifying because the concept of the red thread is so deeply ingrained, so fundamentally incompatible with individual autonomy, that reclaiming your agency feels like destroying the universe.
it feels like an existential threat.
Right. The clinical view explicitly tells us that liberation requires actively destroying the notion of destiny. You have to cut the thread. That proves my point exactly.
That the myth is the problem.
Yes, the concept of the thread is fundamentally incompatible with psychological health. You cannot be free as long as the thread exists.
It is terrifying, yes. But look at the precise adjective used in that conclusion. They don't tell us to cut the toxic thread. They don't tell us to cut the imaginary thread. They tell us to cut the divine thread.
Which means what in a clinical context?
It means the psychological consensus is validating the traditional power of the romantic ideal. It is acknowledging that the red thread is not just a cheap parlor trick of the mind.
Okay.
It holds real, profound emotional and spiritual weight for the human experience. This is exactly why cutting it requires terrifying courage. It is terrifying because you're not just walking away from a bad date or casual fling.
You're walking away from destiny.
You are taking on the agonizing, monumental burden of breaking a sacred bond to save your own life.
Or at least a bond that feels sacred to the person trapped inside it.
Exactly. And the mechanism of liberation is what matters here. You argue that the myth inherently strips agency, but the act of cutting the thread is the ultimate supreme assertion of agency.
By destroying it.
Yes. The individual realizes that while the bond may feel divine, their own survival is paramount. They look at the supposedly unbreakable destiny, they look at the emotional suffocation they are enduring, and they say, "No, I am overriding fate." It is terrifying because it requires the individual to elevate their own self-worth above the dictates of destiny. The myth, therefore, serves as the ultimate crucible for agency. You don't know the true strength of your own autonomy until you're forced to sever a destiny to save yourself.
So you're suggesting that the red noose is almost a necessary developmental stage, that we must become trapped by our romantic ideals in order to learn how to break free of them?
Well, wait.
Because that sounds incredibly dangerous.
I'm not saying it's a prescribed developmental stage, but I am suggesting that the ideal of destiny isn't the enemy of agency. It is the arena in which agency must be tested and forged.
I don't know about that.
Look, humans want the red thread. We crave the security of knowing someone is permanently tied to us. It's a buffer against the existential dread of being alone.
Sure.
But modern psychological health requires us to accept a deeply uncomfortable paradox. We must believe in the depth of our connections, but maintain the fierce autonomy to destroy them if they turn poisonous. The danger isn't the thread itself. The danger is forgetting that you hold the scissors.
I mean, I struggle with the idea that the thread can be considered an ideal if the ultimate triumph is destroying it.
Fair point.
Let's look deeper at the sunk cost fallacy as it applies here, because we touched on it earlier, but the mechanics are crucial.
Right.
The sunk cost fallacy dictates that the more we invest in something, time, emotion, belief, the harder it is to abandon it, even when it is clearly failing.
Yeah.
When a relationship is defined as a regular partnership, your investment is finite. You invest your time. But when a relationship is defined as destiny, the initial investment is infinite. You have invested your very soul.
The perceived cost of leaving becomes catastrophic.
Right. So when psychologists talk about trauma bonding and the sunk cost fallacy intersecting, they are describing a compounding cycle of psychological entrapment. Every single time the partner drains your soul, you rationalize it as the thread tangling.
And you endure it.
You endure it. And by enduring it, you actually increase your investment in the destiny. You think, I have suffered so much for this fate. I have cried so many tears for this destiny. It must be real. Otherwise, all this pain was for nothing. The belief in the red thread actively accelerates the sunk cost fallacy. It provides an unlimited credit line for toxic behavior. This is why I maintain the concept itself is fundamentally flawed.
Because it ignores the evidence.
Exactly. It replaces the evidence-based evaluation of a relationship, is this person treating me well, with a metaphysical mandate, are we meant to be? The former protects you. The latter puts a noose around your neck.
And yet, if we completely abandon the metaphysical mandate, if we strip away all notions of destiny, fate, and soulmates, and we reduce relationships purely to transactional, evidence-based evaluations, we lose something vital to the human experience.
Do we? Yes, we lose the profound resilience that the red thread originally symbolized. If a relationship is just a daily cost-benefit analysis like, is this person providing maximum ROI for my emotional investment today? Then the minute things get difficult, people will just walk away.
That's a bit cynical.
But it's true. They will mistake a normal hurdle, a job loss, a period of depression, a stressful move, for a dead end. The romanticization of destiny, when it is healthy, is exactly what gives couples the grit to survive illness, financial ruin, and personal tragedy.
Oh, okay. I see your point.
The problem is not the existence of the thread. The problem is that modern individuals lack the discernment to tell the difference between the thread stretching under the weight of a shared burden and the thread wrapping around their throat. Well, that requires an almost impossible level of psychological equilibrium from a person who is, by definition, emotionally suffocating.
It's a high bar, yes?
You are asking someone who is actively being drained by a toxic partner to rationally discern whether the tightness around their neck is a healthy test of resilience or a lethal noose. When your brain is flooded with cortisol and dopamine from a trauma bond, your discernment is the very first thing to go.
I am not saying it is easy. I am saying it is the fundamental, inescapable challenge of modern love. We have to balance our deep ancient need for permanent connection with our modern understanding of self-preservation.
Which brings our two perspectives into pretty sharp relief. My position remains that viewing love through the lens of an unbreakable destiny inherently sets a psychological trap.
Right.
By adopting a framework that cannot be broken, we structurally surrender our ability to set boundaries. The myth provides the exact vocabulary needed to rationalize abuse as mere tangling, inevitably turning the red thread of fate into a red noose.
And the car is on the train tracks.
Precisely. The fact that clinical liberation requires the terrifying destruction of this bond proves that the concept of destiny itself is a threat to individual autonomy. If you believe the car is on train tracks, you will never turn the wheel.
And I maintain that the red thread remains a powerful and necessary romantic ideal, representing the profound resilience required for a lifelong partnership.
Right.
The danger we see today is not inherent to the myth, but is a symptom of contemporary society's toxic romanticization of soulmates, driven by the anxieties of modern dating. We use the concept of destiny to rationalize the sunk cost fallacy.
To justify staying.
Yes, we justify our own refusal to leave dead-end relationships. The noose is indeed of our own making, taking responsibility for our agency, picking up the scissors and making the terrifying choice to cut the thread is the necessary price of true liberation.
Yet despite our disagreement on whether the trap is built into the myth or built by the modern dater, it is clear we are in complete convergence regarding the clinical reality of the outcome.
We are. We both acknowledge that using fate to rationalize trauma bonding leads directly to the exact same devastating result: emotional suffocation. When the concept of destiny is weaponized against the self, it ceases to be romance and becomes captivity. Absolutely. The rationalization of pain through the lens of destiny is a highly destructive cognitive mechanism. It's truly fascinating to see how precisely an ancient myth maps onto the clinical definition of the sunk cost fallacy.
It really is.
It reveals how deeply rooted our desire for permanent connection really is, and, how incredibly vulnerable that desire makes us.
The vocabulary changes over the centuries, but the underlying human vulnerabilities, the fear of being alone, the desperate hope for certainty, remain remarkably consistent.
Always.
There is certainly much more to explore in this intersection of psychology and romance, particularly regarding the specific day-to-day mechanisms of how the paradox of choice in modern swipe culture accelerates this desperation for destiny.
Oh, there is so much there. The intersection of an algorithm-based dating culture with the desperate ancient search for a red thread is a psychological paradox that definitely warrants its own deep dive.
I agree. It leaves us with a compelling tension to navigate. We often picture commitment through physical restrictive metaphors like heavy iron chains, padlocks, handcuffs.
Right, the old ball and chain.
Exactly. East Asian mythology offered what seemed like a weightless, invisible alternative in the red thread. But as we've explored today, an invisible thread can restrict our freedom just as completely as iron handcuffs, precisely because we are the ones who refuse to let go.
That is so true.
We leave it to you to decide whether the promise of destiny is a beautiful ideal worth striving for or a psychological trap waiting to be sprung.